I remember my first night as a security guard at Blackwood Hospital like a fever dream. A long, unsettling journey into a place that seemed to breathe with its own dark secrets. It was a chilly autumn evening when I arrived at the hospital, a hulking relic of concrete and peeling paint that looked as if it had been abandoned by time itself. My hands trembled with a mix of excitement and apprehension as I stepped through the heavy front doors. The air inside carried the sharp tang of disinfectant, but underneath it lay a musty, almost rancid odor of decay. A reminder that not all things here were meant to be forgotten. The building was massive, its corridors stretching out like dark, uninviting tunnels. I was given a small flashlight and a set of keys, and with them, I began my rounds. At first, everything seemed ordinary enough. A quiet night, an empty hospital, and the distant hum of the city muffled by the thick walls of Blackwood. But as I moved deeper into the building, I felt an uncanny shift. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, casting long, jittering shadows that seemed to stretch and twist of their own volition. It was as if the darkness was alive, pulsating with a hidden energy that whispered of long-buried memories. I walked slowly down a deserted corridor, my footsteps echoing off the barren walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling, or perhaps by something else moving just out of sight. Then I began to hear it, a soft, indistinct murmur that floated through the hall like a distant lament. I paused, my grip tightening on the flashlight, and strained my ears to catch the sound. It was a low, almost inaudible whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness, but only silence answered me. My pulse quickened as I continued, drawn toward the sound like a moth to a flame. Rounding a corner, I suddenly caught a glimpse of something moving at the far end of the hall. There, standing in the dim light, was a figure, a pale, gaunt shape dressed in what looked like an old hospital gown. The figure was motionless, its eyes hidden in the shadows of its face, and yet, it seemed to be watching me. My heart hammered in my chest as I inched closer, every instinct warning me to run. But curiosity, or perhaps the strange pull of this haunted presence, kept my feet rooted to the cold tile floor. Just as I reached the spot where the figure had stood, it vanished, dissolving into a wall of darkness as if it had never been there at all. I stood frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. Had I imagined it? Or was it a ghost of the past, doomed to wander these forsaken halls? I tried to steady my racing thoughts, reminding myself that the building was old, its creaks and groans merely the sounds of wear and tear. Yet deep down, I knew that something was profoundly wrong about Blackwood Hospital. I made my way to the security office, a cramped room filled with monitors and outdated equipment. The room was dimly lit, the glow of the screens casting an eerie pallor over everything. I sat down at the main console, my hands still trembling, and decided to review the footage from the corridor where I'd seen the mysterious figure. I rewound the tape, scanning through the frames until I found the moment of my encounter. The monitor showed the same deserted corridor I had walked down, the flickering fluorescent lights dancing over the walls. And then in one brief, heart-stopping frame, I saw it, a dark, faceless figure looming silently behind me. It was as if the entity had been waiting for me, its presence a silent accusation of something unspeakable. The realization sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was protesting my presence. As I left the security office to resume my rounds, I began to notice more anomalies. Doors that should have been locked creaked open on their own, and cold drafts, inexplicably frigid in the already chilly air, swept past me as if unseen hands were brushing against my skin. One moment, I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill on my shoulder, a touch that was too deliberate, too human to be the product of the wind. Each step I took seemed to echo not just through the empty halls, but through the very soul of the hospital. Memories of past tragedies, of lives once lived and lost, seemed to seep from the walls. I couldn't help but wonder if the murmurs I'd heard earlier were not merely the building settling, but the voices of the tormented, forever trapped in a state of unrest. In my mind, I recalled the rumors of Blackwood Hospital's troubled past. Stories of mistreatment, of patients who had never found peace, their souls condemned to wander the corridors long after death. My shift dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity as I patrolled room after room, corridor after corridor, each filled with more unanswered questions than the last. The oppressive atmosphere weighed on me, and the hospital's silence was punctuated by the unsettling sounds of creaks, whispers, and the occasional distant echo of what might have been a cry. In one particularly long corridor, I stopped to rest against a cold stone wall, trying to steady my shaking hands. The fluorescent lights above buzzed and flickered, and in the brief moments of darkness, I thought I could see shapes moving just beyond the edge of my vision. I began to suspect that I was not alone, not in the sense of a living person, but in the sense that unseen forces were at work, drawing me deeper into the hospital's grim history. The once familiar layout of the corridors seemed to shift and change, and I found myself taking wrong turns, ending up in rooms I hadn't seen before. Each room held its own eerie story. An empty patient room with a rusted bed, a derelict operating theater where the tools of surgery lay scattered as if abandoned in a hurry, and a dimly lit waiting area where the sound of a phantom heartbeat echoed in the silence. At one point, I ventured near the old morgue, a place that always had a weightier chill about it. The heavy iron door was slightly ajar, and from inside came a faint, irregular tapping noise that resembled the sound of fingernails drumming on a metal surface. My heart pounded as I inched closer, drawn by both fear and a morbid curiosity. I pressed my ear to the cold metal, and for a moment I could almost swear I heard a voice, a quiet, sorrowful whisper saying, "Help me." The plea was so soft that I wasn't sure if it was real or just the wind playing tricks. But then the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness and sending a fresh surge of panic through my veins. Desperation clawed at me as I fumbled for the handle, trying to force the door open. When I finally managed to pry it loose, I burst into the corridor, gasping for air as if I'd escaped a tomb. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept running, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the hospital. But no matter how fast I ran, the feeling of being pursued never left me. I could sense a presence trailing behind, as if an unseen force was determined to follow me until the end of my shift. Back in the security office, the tape of my earlier encounter played over and over in my mind. The dark, faceless figure was a constant reminder that I was no longer dealing with an ordinary night. I reached for the phone to report the incident, but the line was dead. Another glitch in a night that was quickly spiraling into chaos. I looked out the window of the office, only to see a silhouette standing at the far end of the corridor, watching silently. It wasn't just one anomaly after another. It was as if the entire building had become a living, breathing entity, intent on reminding me that I was trespassing on sacred, haunted ground. As the hours wore on, the building's eerie behavior escalated. I heard doors creak open without cause and felt cold, invisible fingers brush past me repeatedly. At one point, while checking a seldom-used wing of the hospital, I caught sight of a woman in a white hospital gown standing in the middle of the corridor. Her skin was as pale as moonlight, and her eyes, if they could be called that, were empty voids. I tried to speak, to ask her what she wanted, but my voice died in my throat. With a slow, deliberate motion, she turned and melted into the shadows, leaving behind only the lingering scent of stale perfume and sorrow. The final hours of my shift were a blur of terror and disbelief. Every creak, every whisper, every fleeting shadow felt like a reminder that Blackwood Hospital was far more than just an abandoned building. It was a repository of pain, loss, and endless regret. I found myself questioning whether I would ever see the light of day again, or if I was destined to become yet another ghostly witness to the hospital's dark history. When the clock finally signaled the end of my shift, I practically ran to the exit, my mind reeling with the events of the night. As I stepped out into the cool night air, the oppressive weight of the hospital lifted, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief tempered with lingering dread. I paused at the threshold, turning back for one last look at Blackwood Hospital. The building stood silent and foreboding, its windows like empty eyes watching my departure. In that moment, I knew that I had experienced something far beyond the realm of normal human fear. I had come face to face with the tormented souls that haunted those corridors. A reminder that some spirits are too tormented to rest, and that once you cross their path, you become part of their eternal story. Even now, weeks later, I still wake up in the dead of night with that memory burning in my mind. The hospital's phantom figures, the flickering lights, and the cold, unseen touches have become a permanent part of me. I've tried to convince myself that it was just an overactive imagination fueled by the legends of Blackwood Hospital. But deep down, I know what I experienced was real. The building is a living testament to all the pain and sorrow it has absorbed over the years, and I was unwittingly drawn into its dark embrace. I left Blackwood Hospital that night with an unsettling realization. A realization that some places harbor more than just the echoes of the past. They harbor the very essence of despair, the remnants of lives lost and dreams shattered. And now, I am forever marked by that encounter, a reluctant witness to a world where the boundary between the living and the dead is all too thin. That night changed me in ways I am still trying to understand. I no longer view empty hallways or creaking doors as mere nuisances. I see them as portals into a realm where restless spirits wander, desperate for release. The memory of that pale, gaunt figure in the hospital gown and the dark, faceless shape captured on the security monitor continues to haunt me. Every time I pass a darkened corridor or hear the distant hum of a flickering light, I can't help but wonder if I am being watched by those who never truly left Blackwood Hospital. In the end, my first night shift at Blackwood Hospital was not just a job. It was an initiation into a world of lingering horrors and forgotten souls. And while I have long since moved on from that role, the chilling memories of that night will always be a part of me. Every so often, when the night grows too quiet and the shadows seem to whisper, I remember that fateful evening and the undeniable truth that some horrors are eternal. My first day working at Midnight Fuel, a lone gas station on a deserted stretch of highway, should have been uneventful. I had heard stories about its isolation, tales of long, silent nights punctuated by nothing more than the howl of the wind and the occasional distant rumble of tires on cracked asphalt. But nothing could have prepared me for what was to come. I arrived just as dusk began to bleed into night, the sky a bruise of deep purples and fading oranges. The station itself was a relic, a crumbling beacon of neon that sputtered against the encroaching dark. The building's faded sign, barely legible, hung precariously over a lot littered with dust and debris. I clocked in, my heart thumping with a mix of excitement and an inexplicable dread that I couldn't shake. Inside, the station was dimly lit by a few overhead fluorescents that buzzed and flickered intermittently. The counter was cluttered with old coffee mugs and a radio that had seen better days. I set about my tasks with the meticulousness of someone who hoped to keep everything in order despite the overwhelming silence outside. Outside, the wind whistled through the barren landscape, carrying with it the lonely howl of an unseen presence. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind playing tricks with the loose bits of paper on the ground. But deep down, I couldn't help feeling that I was being watched. Not long into my shift, as I was checking the small parking lot for any signs of trouble, I noticed something strange, a car pulling up in the distance. Its headlights were dim, barely cutting through the gloom, and there was something off about its shape. It looked as if the vehicle were a distorted mirror image of a normal car, its contours blurry and unsteady, as if it had been seen through a rain-streaked window. Intrigued and a bit uneasy, I stepped outside, squinting into the darkness as I tried to get a better look. The car rolled to a slow stop just in front of the gas station. Its window was rolled down, but I couldn't see anyone inside. "Hello," I called out, my voice swallowed by the vast emptiness of the night. The only response was the persistent whine of the wind. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts urging me to retreat back into the safety of the station. But curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly approached the car. The closer I got, the more I felt an odd sense of disorientation, as if the world around me were bending slightly. I peered inside, but the interior was empty, a void where a driver should have been. Just as I was about to step back, the car's engine stuttered, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I quickly retreated, locking the door behind me, and returned to the counter, my eyes darting to the door every time it creaked or the wind picked up. As midnight approached, the station's radio began to play a scratchy, old tune that I didn't recognize. The melody was eerie and out of place, as if it were a relic from another time, slipping through the static with a ghostly persistence. I tried to focus on my paperwork, but the tune seeped into my thoughts, each note a reminder that something was very wrong. Then, in a moment that will haunt me forever, I caught sight of something in the grimy window behind the register. A dark figure standing in the parking lot. It was vague and shadowy, more suggestion than form, but the impact was undeniable. I spun around, expecting to see the figure up close, but the space outside was empty. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at the blank lot, half expecting the figure to reappear. I bolted back to the counter and double-checked all the locks on the doors, feeling increasingly claustrophobic and exposed. Every creak of the building, every whistle of the wind, felt like a deliberate threat. I started to wonder if the station itself was playing tricks on me. At one point, while glancing at the mirror behind the register, a dusty, old piece that had seen better days, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The mirror wasn't showing just my face. There was a shadow behind me, with eyes that glowed too brightly, too hungry for any human. I spun around, but once again there was nothing there. The reflection was empty save for my own anxious eyes. I forced myself to return to routine. I filled out the necessary logs, counted the cash in the register, and even made a few calls to check if any regular customers might be on the way. But the eerie feeling of being observed never left me. Every minute stretched on, the silence punctuated by the persistent hum of the radio and the occasional distant sound that might have been a car engine, or something else entirely. I kept glancing at the door and the mirror, waiting for the inexplicable presence to reveal itself once more. At around 1 a.m., the feeling of isolation became overwhelming. I decided to step outside for a moment, thinking that perhaps a breath of cold air might help clear my head. The night was ink black, the only light coming from the flickering neon sign and the occasional star daring to peek through the clouds. I took a few tentative steps away from the building, feeling the crunch of gravel under my boots. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the wind. It sounded like a plea or perhaps a warning, but I couldn't make out any words. I paused, straining to listen, and for a moment, the world felt as if it had stopped spinning. My eyes searched the darkness, trying to locate the source of the sound, but I saw nothing. The emptiness of the parking lot mocked my efforts. I returned to the station with a racing heart, more convinced than ever that something was terribly amiss. Back inside, the radio had changed again. Now it played a static-laden version of that same old tune, as if the ghostly melody was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to understand. I sat down at the counter, my mind racing with half-formed thoughts and unsettling images. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of a shadow moving in the periphery of my vision, only to turn and find nothing there. Time seemed to lose all meaning during that long, solitary night. I kept a close eye on the door, checking it repeatedly as if the slightest movement might signal the return of that distorted car or the mysterious figure. I even tried to distract myself by scribbling in a notebook, jotting down every strange detail I could recall. But the words on the page did little to ease the growing dread that filled me. The gas station felt like a trap, a place suspended between the tangible world and a realm of ghosts and forgotten memories. Around 3 a.m., a sudden knock at the door shattered the silence. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I didn't expect any customers at this hour, and the idea that someone might be out there on this deserted stretch of highway filled me with a mixture of hope and terror. I crept to the door, my hand hovering over the lock. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. There was no answer, only the persistent, hollow sound of the wind outside. I opened the door a crack and peered out into the darkness. The beam of my flashlight revealed nothing but the empty lot, the neon sign buzzing above me like a warning. I closed the door quickly, my pulse still racing, and returned to the counter, feeling more alone than ever. I spent the rest of the night on high alert, every sound and shadow amplifying my sense of vulnerability. The station, once just a pit stop on an endless highway, had transformed into a stage for something sinister. I kept glancing at the mirror behind the register, half expecting the shadow with the hungry eyes to appear again. Every so often, the radio would change stations on its own, landing on a frequency that played distant, echoing voices that I could almost understand. The voices were soft and mournful, as if they were reciting lost prayers or telling tales of sorrow. I couldn't tell if they were coming from the air or from within the walls of the station itself. As the first hints of dawn began to light the horizon, I felt as if I were emerging from a nightmare. The long, lonely hours finally gave way to the soft glow of early morning, and I exhaled a shaky sigh of relief. I checked outside once more. The parking lot was empty, the mysterious car and shadowy figures nowhere to be seen. Yet the memory of that inexplicable presence clung to me like a second skin. I closed up the station, locked the doors, and stepped outside for one last look before heading home. The sunrise brought little comfort. Even in the gentle light of day, the experience of that long night felt surreal. I tried to rationalize it all. The strange car, the eerie radio tunes, the ghostly reflection in the mirror, but nothing fit into a neat explanation. It was as if I had brushed against something beyond the ordinary, a realm where the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred. Every detail, from the distorted headlights of that mysterious car to the hungry eyes in the reflection, played over and over in my mind as I drove away, leaving the gas station and its secrets behind. In the days and weeks that followed, I found it hard to shake the memory of that first shift at Midnight Fuel. Every time I passed a quiet stretch of road or saw a flicker of neon in the distance, I felt a chill that took me back to that lonely night. I would catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that distorted car or the shadow with the glimmering eyes lurking just at the edge of my vision. The experience left an indelible mark on me, a constant reminder that sometimes the ordinary can hide the most extraordinary horrors. Even now, when I try to put that night behind me, I find that the memory lingers. It whispers to me in moments of silence, in the creaks of an old building, or the soft static of a forgotten radio channel. Midnight Fuel wasn't just a rundown gas station on a deserted highway. It was a portal to a world where the rules of reality seemed to bend, and where something inexplicable waited just beyond the threshold of understanding. I never did learn who or what had visited me that night, or whether I had truly been alone at all. The experience taught me a valuable lesson about isolation and the nature of fear. Sometimes the most terrifying things are not the ones that roar or shout, but those that quietly, patiently wait in the shadows. The long hours at Midnight Fuel forced me to confront the unknown, to realize that in the stillness of the night, our minds can conjure horrors that feel as real as any tangible threat. I learned that the darkness can be a canvas for our deepest fears, painting images that linger long after the light has returned. I still remember that first day working at Midnight Fuel with a clarity that defies time. The cracked asphalt, the dim neon glow, and that persistent, haunting tune on the radio, all of it has etched itself into my memory. I try to remind myself that it was just a night of strange coincidences and tricks of the light, but deep down, I know that what I experienced was something far more profound. There are moments when the wind picks up, or when a car passes by with headlights that seem to flicker with a strange light, and I can almost feel that presence again, the silent observer that waited for me on that lonely stretch of highway. That night, I learned that some places hold secrets too heavy for daylight, secrets that awaken only under the cover of darkness. Midnight Fuel, with its creaking doors and ghostly reflections, revealed to me that the line between our world and something else can be as thin as the whisper of the wind. And while I eventually left that job behind, the memory of that first shift remains with me. A haunting reminder that sometimes the most unremarkable places hide the darkest mysteries. Even now, when I drive along deserted roads at night, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something out of place. The memory of that long, lonely shift at midnight fuel is a constant companion, a shadow that follows me in the silence of the night. And though the sun may rise and the roads may clear, I know that in the quiet moments, the ghost of that first shift will always be there, watching, waiting, and reminding me that some presences are never truly gone. I thought that starting a job at Evermore Funeral Home would be somber and respectful, a quiet service to those in mourning, a place of gentle reflection. I imagined a day filled with hushed conversations, careful rituals, and a dignified atmosphere. But nothing could have prepared me for the terror that unfolded on that first day. The building itself was a study in elegant decay. As I approached the heavy black doors early that morning, I couldn't help but notice how the structure exuded a strange magnetism, a pull that made my skin crawl even before I stepped inside. The front lobby was dimly lit by antique lamps, and every surface, from the polished wooden floors to the deep, rich velvet drapes hanging in the reception area, whispered of a long-forgotten grandeur now overtaken by sorrow. The air was thick with the mingled scents of incense and formaldehyde, a constant reminder that death lingered in every corner. I had been hired as an assistant, tasked with preparing the chapel for an upcoming service, arranging flowers, and ensuring every detail was perfect. My hands trembled slightly as I began my work. I set about arranging the rows of chairs in the chapel, dusting the worn pews, and placing a vase of white lilies on the altar. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft echo of my footsteps and the slow ticking of an old clock on the wall. Even as I worked, I felt an unsettling sensation, as if unseen eyes were watching me from the shadows. I told myself it was just nerves and the heavy atmosphere of the place, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. After finishing in the chapel, I moved on to the embalming room, a place I had heard whispered about in hushed tones by the other employees. The room was sterile and unnervingly cold, its metal tables and outdated equipment arranged with a clinical precision that contrasted sharply with the building's decaying elegance. I set about my tasks, trying to focus on the mundane details. Yet almost immediately, the atmosphere shifted. As I walked past one of the closed caskets, the dim overhead light caught a slight movement, a subtle twitch on what I assumed was just the play of shadows on a polished surface. For a split second, I thought I saw a hand shift on the lid of the casket. I froze, heart pounding, and for a moment I doubted my own eyes. I reassured myself that it was nothing more than my imagination, fueled by the eerie solitude of the room. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, a prickling awareness that I was not alone. I pressed on, determined to finish my work. In the viewing room, where the faces of the departed were displayed in somber portraits, I began dusting an ornate, antique mirror hanging on one wall. The mirror's surface was clouded with age, its once bright reflection now muted and ghostly. As I worked, I caught a glimpse of something behind me in the reflection, a vague shape moving silently in the background. I spun around quickly, only to find the room empty and bathed in a silence that suddenly felt oppressive. The temperature dropped abruptly, as if a cold, sorrowful presence had brushed past me, leaving an icy trail of grief in its wake. My pulse raced, and I tried to convince myself that exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind. I returned to my tasks, yet every object, every corner of the room, now seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a life steeped in mourning and despair. The quiet that had once been comforting now echoed with soft, almost imperceptible whispers, as if the dead themselves were trying to speak to me. At first, these murmurs were so faint I could barely make them out. But as the day wore on, they grew louder, more insistent, each whisper layered with a plea for release or perhaps a desperate attempt to be remembered. By mid-afternoon, the building had transformed into a labyrinth of sorrow. Every corridor I passed, every door I opened, seemed to reveal a new facet of the home's tragic history. I could not shake the feeling that the departed were restless in Evermore Funeral Home. I took a break in a small sitting room, sinking into an overstuffed armchair that had seen better days. I sipped on lukewarm coffee, my thoughts drifting to the soft crying I had heard earlier. Was it merely the sound of wind, or the lament of a lost soul? The quiet of the room seemed to absorb even my heartbeat, leaving me alone with the unanswered questions that now swirled around me like a dense fog. My supervisor, Mr. Caldwell, finally stopped by to check on my progress. He was a stern man with a gaze that rarely softened, but even he seemed to sense the unspoken terror that had woven itself into the fabric of the day. He walked past me with a brief nod, and for a fleeting moment our eyes met. In that look, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding, or was it a silent warning? He offered no words of comfort, simply continued with his own tasks, as if the eerie happenings were merely part of the building's long and storied past. When I hesitated to ask if he too had felt the inexplicable chill in the air, he simply replied, "Evermore has its own way about it. You get used to it." But I knew deep down that there was nothing normal about what I was experiencing. The rest of the day became a series of unsettling events that piled on my growing dread. Every time I passed a dark corner or heard the soft hum of the ancient ventilation system, my mind conjured images of forlorn faces and outstretched hands reaching from the abyss. I began to notice small, almost imperceptible signs: a door that creaked open on its own, a cold draft that seemed to follow me like a living thing, and that persistent sound of weeping that echoed faintly in the halls. In the embalming room, the whispering had turned into a murmur, each word indistinct but heavy with sorrow. At one point, I felt a light touch on my arm, a delicate, almost tender brush that disappeared as quickly as it came, leaving me questioning if the dead were trying to connect with me. When it came time to prepare for the next day's service, I meticulously arranged the flowers in the chapel, placed lit candles along the altar, and ensured that every detail was perfect. Yet, as I worked, the air itself felt laden with a burden of grief, as if the building was mourning its own fate. The ornate clock in the foyer ticked slowly, its measured sound blending with the hushed voices that seemed to seep out of the walls. It was in these moments of solitary work that I felt the weight of the departed most acutely. Each breath I took filled with the echoes of lives long gone. Late in the afternoon, as shadows stretched long across the floor and the day began its slow descent into night, I found myself alone once more in the embalming room. The overhead lights cast a cold, bluish glow that distorted the familiar shapes of the room into something otherworldly. I walked slowly past the rows of caskets, my eyes scanning for any sign of movement. And then in the half-light, I saw it, a subtle shift, a tiny movement on the edge of my vision. One of the casket lids had moved ever so slightly, as if an unseen hand had brushed against it. I stood frozen, heart thundering in my chest, wondering if I was now truly caught between two worlds. Before I could react, the movement ceased, and the room fell silent once again. I told myself it was only the play of shadows, that fatigue had worn down my senses, but the memory clung to me like a dark secret. By the time I gathered my things to leave, the whispers had grown into a chorus of sorrow, a sound that resonated in the empty corridors and haunted every step I took. I made my way to the main entrance, the heavy doors looming before me like the portal to another realm. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I couldn't help but glance back at the building. Evermore Funeral Home stood there, silent and inscrutable, its windows like dark eyes watching my departure. In that moment, I knew that I had not just entered a place of mourning, but a liminal space where the living and the dead coexisted in uneasy company. Driving away that night, my mind replayed the events of the day in an endless loop. I wondered if I had become a keeper of secrets, witness to the whispered laments and hidden sorrow of the departed. Every creak in the car, every gust of wind outside, made me question whether I had truly left Evermore behind, or if a piece of that haunted day would follow me forever. In the days that followed, I tried to piece together rational explanations for what I had experienced. Mr. Caldwell assured me that Evermore Funeral Home had a long and storied past, one that was marked by tragedies and losses that no one could ever fully erase. Yet, despite his calm demeanor, I sensed a quiet resignation in his voice, a recognition that some mysteries were beyond explanation. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had intruded into a world where the dead were not at rest, that the building itself was a living repository of grief and unfinished stories. At night, when the world was quiet and my thoughts turned inward, I would lie awake wondering if the soft weeping I had heard was a plea for help, a call for someone to finally let the departed speak. The experience left an indelible mark on my soul. I began to see subtle signs everywhere, in the glimmer of a tear on a portrait's cheek, in the delicate ripple of a curtain as if brushed by an unseen hand, and I couldn't help but feel that the building's sorrow had seeped into me. Looking back now, I realized that my first day at Evermore Funeral Home was more than just an initiation into a job. It was a plunge into a realm where life and death mingled in every shadow, where every corner held a secret, and every silence was filled with whispers of the past. I learned that even in a place designed for respect and remembrance, darkness could live quietly, patiently waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I left that day forever changed, carrying with me the heavy knowledge that some spaces are not meant to be cleansed of their past. Instead, they hold on to it, allowing it to shape the very air you breathe. Now, whenever I pass by Evermore Funeral Home, I catch a glimpse of those sorrowful eyes in the portraits, a silent reminder of the day I walked its haunted halls. The building stands as a quiet sentinel, a keeper of memories too heavy for the living, where the departed continue to murmur their stories in the dead of night. And though I have long since moved on from that job, the echoes of that first day still follow me. A constant reminder that in the space between life and death, even the softest whisper can carry the weight of endless sorrow. Every so often, when I am alone and the night is still, I remember the gentle weeping in the embalming room, the fleeting movement in the mirror, and the icy touch that brushed past me as if to say, I am still here. In those moments, I understand that the departed at Evermore Funeral Home never truly leave. They simply wait, suspended in time, for someone who will listen to their silent lament. And I, for one, will never forget that first day, when I learned that the boundary between the living and the dead is as thin as a whisper, and that sometimes, the dead have more to say than the living ever will. I never imagined that my first day as the caretaker of an abandoned amusement park, once known as the Carnival of Lost Souls, would plunge me into such a surreal nightmare. When I signed the papers for the job, I thought it would be a quiet, if eerie, opportunity to work in isolation. I envisioned spending my days restoring a relic of a bygone era, cleaning up old rides, and perhaps even unearthing some forgotten history. Instead, I found myself stepping into a world where reality blurred with something far more sinister. I arrived at dusk. The sky was a canvas of bruised purples and fiery oranges, and the last of the sunlight slipped away as I drove up the long, overgrown road leading to the park. The gates were rusted and barely hanging on, creaking ominously in the soft breeze. Even from a distance, the park exuded an unsettling energy, as if it were alive with memories of happier times that had decayed into sorrow and regret. Determined to begin repairs and clean up despite the local legends warning against disturbing its restless past, I stepped out of my truck and took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. Almost immediately, I was struck by the uncanny atmosphere. A faded carnival melody drifted on the wind, a distorted, warped tune that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was as if the very air carried the echoes of laughter and song from decades past, twisted into something unrecognizable. The sound pulled me toward a decrepit carousel at the park's heart. I walked slowly across the cracked asphalt, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The painted horses on the carousel, their colors faded and chipped by time, stared out with blank, glassy eyes. They looked frozen in a perpetual moment of joy, yet their stillness now seemed like a mocking reminder of lost innocence. As I approached, the carousel began to creak and slowly rotate. The motion was unnatural, as if powered by a force that defied logic. I stood there, transfixed, watching the once delightful ride move with a slow, deliberate creak. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't decide whether to be fascinated or terrified. The carousel's music grew louder, its notes discordant, and the soft strains of a calliope mingled with the warped melody drifting through the night air. My heart pounded as I heard what might have been children's giggles, soft, mocking, and unsettling in their mirth. I spun around, scanning the shadowed corners of the park, but saw nothing except the twisted silhouettes of old rides and overgrown trees. Then, in a particularly dark and isolated part of the park, I glimpsed a figure. A clown stood there in the gloom, his grin impossibly wide, his eyes deep pools of darkness that seemed to suck in the light around him. I blinked hard, and when I looked again, the figure was gone, leaving only the echo of that cruel, mocking laughter behind. I pushed forward, my mind racing with disbelief and dread. Each step deeper into the park made me feel as if I were leaving behind the familiar world and entering a realm governed by its own terrible rules. The once colorful game stalls now lay abandoned and broken. Rusted signs hung askew, and every surface was layered with dust and cobwebs. Yet amid all this decay, there was an energy, a sinister force, that seemed to make the park pulse with life. A cold wind swept through the empty lanes, whispering secrets in a language I couldn't understand. It tugged at my clothes and sent shivers through my body as I passed by rows of rusted bumper cars and derelict funhouses. The sound of an out-of-tune calliope reached my ears intermittently, its notes warped and haunting, echoing faintly through the deserted grounds. The further I ventured, the more I felt as if unseen eyes were watching me from the shadows. The legends of the park's cursed past, once nothing more than local lore, now took on a terrifying reality. I soon found myself drawn to an old funhouse. Its facade was crumbling, the once bright paint now faded and peeling. As I stepped through the broken door, I was met with a maze of mirrors and warped reflections. In one dusty mirror, I saw not only my tired face, but a horde of spectral figures dancing in grotesque celebration. They moved in a macabre ballet, their smiles twisted and their eyes empty. I spun around, desperate to find the source of the vision, but the funhouse was empty save for my echoing footsteps. The sound of laughter, distant, hollow, and mocking, seemed to reverberate off the walls, as if the very building were alive with the voices of lost souls. Every corner of the park now vibrated with a sinister energy. The laughter from the carousel and the funhouse mixed with the cold, harsh whisper of the wind to create a chorus of unease. I felt as if the park itself were trying to communicate with me, sending signals through the rustle of leaves and the creak of old metal. My instincts screamed that I should leave, but something compelled me to uncover the secrets buried in this haunted place. I made my way to the caretaker's shack, a small, dilapidated building that had once served as the control room for the park. The shack was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, and the musty smell of disuse filled the air. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to steady my racing heart. Every sound outside, the creak of the rides, the distant calliope, the echo of laughter, seemed amplified, as if the park was not ready to let me go. Even as I sat in the relative safety of the shack, I could feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing against the walls, their gaze full of silent accusation. Inside, I spread out the tools and supplies I'd brought with me, determined to begin repairs and cleanup. Yet even as I tried to focus on the practical tasks, the oppressive atmosphere of the park seeped into my thoughts. I kept glancing at the small window, half expecting to see the ghostly figure of the clown or the spectral dancers from the funhouse. The idea that I wasn't alone in the park was all too real now. As the night deepened, so did the park's hold on me. I decided to check on some of the old rides that were in dire need of repair. I walked to the Ferris wheel, its towering structure silhouetted against the night sky. The wheel was motionless, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it might start turning at any moment, as if stirred by an unseen hand. I ran my hand along the cold metal, the surface rough and unyielding, and felt a shiver run through my body that wasn't entirely due to the chill in the air. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a small, quick flash near one of the ticket booths. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there except the dim outline of the abandoned building. My mind raced with possibilities. Had I imagined it? Was it another trick of the light? But deep down, I knew the park was far more than just an empty relic. It was a place where the veil between the living and the dead was dangerously thin. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I moved through the park. Every shadow held a secret. Every rustle of leaves was a whispered warning. I tried to shake off the creeping dread, focusing instead on the tangible task of mending what had once been the vibrant heart of the carnival. Yet every repaired bolt and every cleaned ride was accompanied by the sensation of being watched, as if the park's long-departed patrons were judging my every move. At one point, while I was near a decrepit midway filled with rusted carnival games, I heard soft giggling again, this time coming from a dark corner behind a row of abandoned game booths. My heart thumped wildly as I crept toward the sound, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. When I reached the spot, the giggling stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound. I stood there for a long moment, my eyes scanning the darkness, but nothing moved. I couldn't tell if the laughter had been real or just another figment of my troubled imagination, yet it left me with an overwhelming sense of unease. By the time I returned to the caretaker's shack, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the horizon. Exhausted and mentally drained, I locked the door behind me and sat down heavily at a rickety wooden table. I tried to steady my nerves by scribbling notes about the night's events, hoping that putting everything into words might somehow make the surreal experience more real and more controllable. But as I wrote, the images refused to fade. The slow creak of the carousel, the mocking giggles of unseen children, the brief glimpse of a clown with eyes like endless voids, and the bizarre reflections in the funhouse mirror. Even as the light of dawn began to push back the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that the park was not done with me. The sounds of the carnival, the faint echo of laughter, the creak of old rides, remained etched in my mind like a persistent refrain. I realized that some places never truly let you leave, that they mark you in a way that stays with you long after you've walked away. The Carnival of Lost Souls was one such place. Driving away that morning, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the spectral figures of dancing carnival goers or the shadow of that wide-grinned clown following my car along the empty highway. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a product of my overactive imagination, a byproduct of isolation and eerie legends. Yet deep down, I knew what I experienced was real. The abandoned amusement park had a soul, a history stained with sorrow and a hunger for remembrance. Now, even on quiet nights, when the world is still and the only sound is the whisper of the wind, I sometimes think back to that first day. I recall the eerie melody on the wind, the unnatural motion of the carousel, and the way the shadows seemed to move with a mind of their own. I remember the cold, mocking laughter and the fleeting glimpse of a clown with eyes that held nothing but darkness. Those images have a way of creeping into my thoughts, reminding me that some places harbor secrets too profound for the light of day. In the weeks that followed, I began to restore parts of the park, carefully documenting each repair and each strange occurrence. Neighbors in the nearby town spoke in hushed tones about the park's haunted history. Stories of a once thriving carnival that ended in tragedy and despair, of laughter that turned to sorrow and joy that was swallowed by time. They warned me that disturbing the park's restless past could awaken old ghosts, that the lost souls might never be satisfied with a quiet rest. Every day, as I walked through the park, I felt as if I were sharing space with memories too heavy to bear. I often paused by the old Ferris wheel, wondering about the people who once rode it, smiling and laughing under a sky that now seemed so distant. I'd hear the faint sound of a calliope playing an out-of-tune tune on the wind, and for a moment, I could almost believe that the ghosts of the carnival were reaching out to me, begging to be remembered. That first day at the Carnival of Lost Souls left me with a lingering dread, a feeling that clung to me long after the sun rose. I knew then that I had not just taken a job. I had stepped into a living relic of pain and lost hope, a place where the line between the living and the dead was as thin as a whisper. And as I locked the door of the caretaker's shack each night, I could hear the distant echoes of laughter and the creak of old rides, a reminder that some places never truly let you leave. Even now, as I sit at home on quiet evenings, the memory of that surreal first day is never far from my mind. I often catch myself looking over my shoulder or listening a little too intently for the sound of that distorted carnival music. The Carnival of Lost Souls has become more than just a job or a haunted park. It's a part of me, a dark chapter in my life that I carry with every beat of my heart. I know I will never forget that first night under the twilight, when the park's decaying beauty and relentless spirit reached out to claim me. It was a day that transformed my understanding of what it means to be haunted, by ghosts, by memories, and by the inexorable pull of a past that refuses to fade away. And as I move forward in life, I do so with the quiet knowledge that sometimes the most unassuming places can hide the darkest secrets, waiting for the right moment to remind you that you are never truly alone. In the end, my first day at the abandoned amusement park was a lesson in humility and fear, a reminder that the past is never dead, it's not even past. And as I continue my work here, restoring what I can and learning to live with what I cannot change, I find myself both terrified and strangely comforted by the enduring presence of the Carnival of Lost Souls. It has marked me, shaped me, and left me with a lingering dread that some places, no matter how long they've been forgotten, will always keep a piece of your soul. And so, even as I close this chapter of my first day, I know that the echoes of that surreal night will follow me wherever I go, a constant whisper in the dark, a reminder that once you step into a place where the dead still dance, you are never quite free of their haunting embrace.